Hello and welcome to another reaction video. This week we're reacting to Warhammer the Old World as described by Pancreasnowork. As everyone knows, I'm a big fan of fantasy settings and we've been getting into Warhammer lately, so Warhammer Fantasy seems just like the perfect thing to get into. So yeah, if you're interested, watch along. I hope you enjoy, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you do. So let's get into it.
I like when people get into Warhammer. It's always a joy to have more people to play with and interact with in the hobby space. It's a new chance for me to try and convert someone, anyone, into accepting that the Eldar are actually really cool and interesting, and please just for 5 minutes stop saying elf bad. But speaking of elves, every time there's a wave of people that first learn about Warhammer, there's always one thing in common with them. None of them realize there's more to Warhammer than Space Marines, Tyranids, and spikier Space Marines. There's a whole other pair of settings that also exist, and they just fly right under the radar half the time. And this sucks, because the best Warhammer setting is right there. Yeah, GW ended it, but then it came back. And if you don't want to, you don't even have to collect thousands of dollars of minis to play with this one. Kind of. Warhammer Fantasy has been around longer than even 40k. It's had its ups, it's had its downs, it got blown up for a little bit, but thanks to Total War, Vermintide, and the constant nagging of the community, you can once again play in the old world. With elves, dwarves, and humans as standard, but also some more out-there races, such as magical frogs, rats, and Walmart shoppers. And not enough people know about them. Not nearly enough, and not nearly enough people learn that this setting is even a thing. So I'm going to be doing my part today. Today I'm going to learn you all about every faction in Warhammer Fantasy. Some of them had extensive army lists and plot relevance, some of them languished when unupdated army books for years on end, and some of them until recently were relegated to about 3 pages of background lore. Doesn't matter, we're doing it all. If you can conceivably consider it an actual faction, they'll be here. Think of it as a companion to this video. That one was me trying to overview the setting as a whole, and this one is about the groups of people in the setting. So let's dive into a world of fantasy and see what all that nonsense about them having the Warhammer is all about.
But you're about to start
listening to me list off all kinds of factions. And do you know what you could be listening to me with? Raycon and their Everyday Earbuds, the sponsor of this video. Raycon's Everyday Earbuds are some of the finest available on the market, and they've got a new and improved version just to go that extra mile. Let's just get right into the features.
Pretty sweet. I do use them when I'm painting.
So if you and someone else want to share the music, you can with no problems. Active noise cancellation, because sometimes the outside world just needs to take a step back for a bit. And a new sleek ergonomic design to make them look and feel better than ever before. It's even got a cool protective case to keep them nice and safe. I've got them colored in a nice purple Galaxy-themed case. It's got a nebula on it and everything. It's nice. You can get them in other options, though. There's plenty of colors to choose from. You know what's better than that? A 32-hour battery life that gets 90 minutes of battery per 10 minutes of charging. I forget to charge my headphones pretty often, and combined with my complete and utter lack of patience, that's usually a bad thing. But the Everyday Earbuds got my back. You can just charge them up for a little bit, and they're good to go. I use them when I'm painting or assembling minis. It's nice and relaxing, and the sound quality lets me tune out the world and get into the swing of things. This is good because, as you can see, I have a lot of minis to work on. But even with your own shopping needs, you can still enjoy the Raycon Everyday Earbuds. Click the link in the description or go to buyraycon.com/Pancreasnowork to get 15% off your Raycon purchase, plus free shipping. They're already half the price of other brands, and with my link, you can get them at an even better price. Spice up how you listen to music, podcasts, and more with Raycon's Everyday Earbuds. Now then, let's talk about where it all began.
Let's go.
That's orc spelled with a C, by the way, not a K. But across the board, the greenskins of Warhammer Fantasy aren't that different from the ones in 40k, which is why we're starting with them.
I love that mask.
They're mushroom people, they're green. If you took an orc from 40k and put him in a greenskin tribe in Fantasy, he probably wouldn't be able to tell the difference. Might wonder why no one has a decent
pretty sure there are
around, but he'd be
savager versions of orcs in 40k.
He might even be happier, because these orcs have characters like Grimgor instead of Ghazghkull. There are no thinking and tactics for Grimgor, only beating everything near him to death. The greenskins used to have some pretty different lore, being
it's not stupid if it works.
Else. They had half-orcs, and they didn't reproduce with mushroom spores. Then as time went on, that was moved away from, and eventually we came to where we are now in the old world. That being that the orcs
good old classic square bases
ships when they came to the Warhammer Fantasy world. More on them later. From there, they naturally began spreading out across the entire world. The old ones and their servants did their best to get rid of the orcs, as they did all other races they weren't quite fond of, but you can't get rid of the orcs once they're on a planet. It's just not possible. So nowadays, if you wander around a given area long enough, chances are you'll find some greenskins kicking about, making things worse for whoever lives there. The orcs themselves are one of the biggest similarities between the two settings. The biggest guy is in charge of the tribe, and if you get a real big boss, he might be in charge of multiple tribes. And when you get a really big boss, you can get a whole proper WoW going. When this happens, you usually get a whole lot of dead humans and dwarfs. Painting something red still makes it go faster, painting it blue makes it luckier, and can block arrows from killing the blue-painted orc. and they still love looting.
It's
not nearly as much
weird
as
that they
in
don't
40K,
just paint
but you can always
everything
find
red.
an orc in a tribe wearing dwarf plate armor or wielding a human greatsword he grabbed off a corpse. They do have some more savage brethren who judge other orcs for using things like basic tools or digging a pit to shit in rather than just letting it drop where you stand, but aside from being a bit more magical, those orcs aren't really all that different. Where you get the biggest change, though, is with the goblins. See, in 40K, grots are an entire species of plot irrelevance to the orcs. You'll get one like Makari once in a blue moon who are allowed to be in the shadow
they
of the
don't have
spotlight of a
Gretchen.
far more famous orc, but the goblins in fantasy are an actual threat all by themselves. Sure, they're still cowardly and will refuse a stand-up fight unless they outnumber the enemy 40 to 1.
What's
Sure,
with the,
they're still kicked
with
around
the
by the
moon
orcs and
motif?
are used to do all the manual construction stuff. And sure, they're still slightly smarter than the orcs, so anything resembling any actual construction or research is done by them. But every now and then, not often, but every now and then, you get a goblin who's a cut above the rest. And when that happens, everyone's in trouble. The goblins are cunning little buggers. They know in a straight-up fight they're gonna lose, so they'll wait till the biggest orc around is sleeping and slit his throat, or poison his food, or convince him there's something shiny in a nearby cave filled with hungry
the
trolls.
kobold way.
And sometimes, if they're really insane, they'll
Yeah, I'm
overdose
seeing
on
lots
literally
of,
magic
little
mushrooms,
moons.
and when they come
I
back
like
to
it.
reality,
I have
they've
no idea
slaughtered
what it's
every
about.
orc in charge in a manic frenzy. Now, instead of a big green moron who just about knows which way is forward leading the army, you have someone like Skarsnik leading an orc army. A green little Sun Tzu who's gonna run circles around you and your entire military. Or you can get one that pretty much just lucks into the position, like Grom the Paunch, hallowed be his girth. Instead of being clever, he just got incredibly lucky
Big
and was
boy.
forced to eat troll meat. Instead of exploding, which is normally what happens when you do that, he just kept growing
Oh,
alongside
he just grew
it.
bigger.
3 things
That's
happened.
pretty cool.
1, he got so incredibly fat he'd beat rival orcs by sitting on them. 2, he
See, some
became
of this
a legend among
characterization is
goblins
already better
everywhere,
than some of the
alpha
characters in
male
40K.
fantasy they all wish they could be. And 3, he nearly ended the world by sailing from the equivalent of the Middle East or Africa to the middle of the Atlantic and destabilizing the High
Also, what
Elves.
the hell
If
is
you
that
like
in the
grots but
background
wish
with the
they
wings?
could, you know, do anything important ever, maybe take a look at the goblins. Their history really isn't anything special though, mostly because they're greenskins and what you see is what you get. Usually, they beat each other up. Every now and again, one of them beats up enough orcs that he convinces them all to go beat someone else up instead. This continues until that war boss is killed, and then the orcs disband and go back to beating each other up again. Some evil dwarfs like to use them as slaves, and when they tried to make bigger, stronger, and smarter
The
orcs to
armor
use
is
as
so
slaves,
badass,
they immediately
though.
learned why that was a bad idea when the orcs revolted. If you like being mean and green, you'll like the orcs. And one crucial thing I nearly forgot, they love to dance. Warzag may be the prophet of the orc
Nice.
gods first, but he's a hell
Look
of a
at them
dancer
moves.
second. Now let's get out of the realm of similarities and into some things fantasy really does different. When the Old Ones showed up, the planet they arrived on was ideal for creating the ultimate weapon to fight chaos. Of course, they still had to create it, so to do that, they started by moving the planet closer to the sun to warm it up, which pissed off a lot of things on it, like the dragons. Speaking of, there were a lot of races on the planet that wouldn't really like to share the room with the Old Ones' creations. So to help them with the legwork, as well as get rid of all those fellas, the Old Ones created the Lizardmen. They also created most
Nice.
of the other playable races in
It
the
looks
setting,
so cool.
unless otherwise stated, assume all these factions started out as the test tube babies of the Old Ones in one way or another. The Lizardmen were not this ultimate weapon against chaos, although they were still pretty good at fighting. You know how I said the orcs resisted extermination by the Old Ones? That was just them who managed it. Everyone else fell under a tide of angry lizards, dinosaurs, or angry lizards riding dinosaurs. With that small
epic.
little bit of genociding out of the way, the Old Ones set about making the
I would
world
love a
fit their
T-Rex to
needs.
ride
The
on.
Lizardmen were their chief assistants, and to be the best secretaries they could possibly be, the Old Ones made them in several different flavors. All of them with a dash of Mesoamerican cultures thrown in, because if you have the option
That's
to
a
have
cool
Aztec
style as
lizard
well.
riding dinosaurs, you have no good reason not to take it. First, you have the Slan. The Slan are the best wizards in all the world. They may be big fat toad people, but the first generation ones were the ones who changed the entire planet's orbit, moving around where it needed to be in space. Moving down
That's
the generational
insane.
line, they did get weaker, but that's highly
Who would
relative.
win in a
Second generation
psychic
Slan
duel?
could only
A
cause
Slan
entire
or
mountain
Magnus the
ranges
Red?
to suddenly appear at the drop of a hat. These were the Lizardmen who directly worked with the Old Ones and delivered their messages and will to the rest of them. Next, you have the Saurus. Stupid people might think that since the Lizardmen are a Bronze Age civilization at best, they're not much of a threat. Then an 8-foot-tall monster from the Cretaceous period clubs you to death with an obsidian axe, and you find out just how the Saurus were able to depopulate an entire planet. These were the generals of the Lizardmen armies. They were bred for war and only war. They're pretty straightforward, and all their characters have the same background of bred to kick ass, but this is Warhammer. That's a feature, not a bug, and they break it down to its simplest possible form. Next are the skinks. They're little chibi gecko axolotl things that do to the day-to-day management of lizardman society.
They look so cool.
You need a building planned out or to do basic diplomacy, you send the skinks. They're also skirmishers. When the trees start speaking great planese, it's the skinks doing it. They've even got their own god all to themselves, Sotek. It was a bit of a controversy when he came around at first, but the rest of the lizardmen seemed content enough to let him be worshipped. Finally, we have the Croxagores. They're alligator men. They build the buildings and gator death roll all over enemy armies. That's it.
No, I don't think
when Chaos first came and the old ones
much
fled,
of a
the
chance.
lizardmen had to figure out how to not only survive, but continue the old ones' work in their absence, which they kind of sort of
How
have
could
been
you not
pulling
collect
off a little
dinosaurs?
bit. They held off
Everyone
the
loves
invasion at the cost of
dinosaurs.
almost all the first Slan and most
if you
of their
don't,
spawning pools,
you're
turning them
lying.
into a very numerically disadvantaged race. Not that this stops them from still sometimes rampaging across the world, but they are largely held up in the jungles of Lustria nowadays, also known as South America, because Warhammer Fantasy is just Earth if someone with really shaky hands drew a map of it. They're isolationists, the Slan will spend centuries at a time meditating on the few plaques the old ones have left, and they really hate when tourists come to Lustria because it's usually to steal those plaques. They're all gold, you see, because gold doesn't tarnish or rust. Convenient for writing things down in a jungle, less convenient when all the warm bloods come to steal the shiny stuff. If you see a lizardman army, you're either screwed because the Great Plan dictates your death, or screwed because you're somewhere they don't think you should be. Very simple faction, but again, that's a positive.
That comes out of the
Sometimes
jungle
being
after you.
dino-brained is the way to go. Also known as the Imperium, but not as awful. These guys are the default protagonist faction. They're the strongest nation of men in the world, and that's no meaningless boast here, because there's actual competition they have in that department, unlike the Imperium. They formed about 2,500 years prior to the setting's modern day, when a pretty cool dude named Sigmar was born. Sigmar had a dream, uniting the scattered tribes of barbarian into one unified nation of mankind, to drive back the darkness and bring peace to the land. He did this chiefly by beating up everyone who disagreed with him, but in fairness, most of them deserved it. If this sounds familiar, let me just remind you that this guy was here first. Plus, Sigmar realized that outright killing everyone just because they disagree with you is perhaps a bad idea that will lead to problems later down the line, so he settled for only beating them up. Sigmar didn't just beat up people, though. He also beat up a lot of orcs. Like, a whole lot of orcs. So many orcs that the dwarfs swore eternal friendship with mankind because if Sigmar is so kick-ass, surely the rest of humanity can't be that bad either. He united most of the tribes of man in the area, and you better believe I'll come back to the most later.
I always love the old school map designs.
50 years later, he just up and left. A little bit after that,
Wish
he
we still
became
had
god,
these.
and the Empire soon worshipped Sigmar as the chief god of their pantheon. The Empire is pretty unique as far as fantasy factions go. Usually a fantasy setting will reach the medieval era, and then very explicitly never move past that for the next trillion years of its history. The Empire isn't like that. When Sigmar was doing his thing, it was barely the Iron Age. The dwarfs giving them steel weapons every now and then was considered the height of technological advancement. Nowadays, 2,500 years later, the Empire has tanks. Good tanks.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Look, for a Renaissance age civilization, tanks are pretty damn impressive no matter how good they actually are.
That's true.
They have factories, mechanical horses, and countless other things that make you wonder if the book you're reading was put in the fantasy section by mistake. They also have wizards who scam people out of $50 for the thrill of it, politicians who constantly need to be wrangled by the one competent guy in the entire government, and enough floppy hats to arm the entire Holy Roman Empire with. They're still normal people, though. The three things that make the Empire great aren't genetically modified super
very medieval
soldiers,
Germany
or lost
themed.
technological secrets from a golden age, or even the
I
direct
think it's
intervention of
medieval
their
Germany.
gods. It's faith, steel, and gunpowder. A whole lot of each. Give a man a halberd, a cause to fight for, and his friends by his side, and it turns out you can push back even the most determined of evil murder Vikings time and time again. Most Warhammer Fantasy books follow the Imperial characters around, and you get a good feel for just how fleshed out this land is through them. You've got the Heartlands, sure, places like Altdorf, where it's interconnected with the wider world, magic runs through the very city through its colleges of magic, and elves and dwarfs can be seen regularly. Then you have backwater shitholes like Ostermark, where the people are outnumbered by every human nearby that wants to kill them, and guns are still a scary black magic invention for a good half the population. Or Averland, whose most noticeable trait is that they hunt halflings for sport there. There's halflings in the Empire.
They do have halflings.
They can vote on the next emperor because they baked a previous one a really good meal. They also had a civil war over pie. Don't be a halfling in Averland. You're gonna decorate someone's mantelpiece sooner or later. Of course, this is still Warhammer, fantasy or not.
Oh,
sure,
they even have the Inquisition.
Not as awful as the Imperium, but it still has witch hunters who will burn you alive for being a wizard or being a mutant.
It's nice to know that the hat style never changes.
That's also a sign of chaos mutation. And it's still a Renaissance age civilization. For 90% of people, this means it's a medieval civilization, but you might see more pretty statues and paintings than your ancestors did. You're still probably gonna die of the water making you poop too much. They're bordered by the undead, beastmen are everywhere once you leave the city limits, and worst of all, they have people who have sex with horses for neighbors. The Empire is constantly on the defense. From orcs, from chaos, from beastmen, which are a different kind of chaos, and really anyone else who's feeling a bit bored that day. But the average citizen of the Empire will do their part to keep the hordes at bay, and at the end of the day, they did this for 2,500 years until the authors decided reality itself had to go, which is a pretty good track record. They're a human, relatable nation, like if the Imperial Guard
yeah, we really need some Warhammer movies or TV shows like this.
9001, model on sale now for $60. It's grounded, with people having normal struggles, but also fantastical, with wizards and monsters being everywhere. They do have one ultimate ace in the hole, though, the reigning emperor, Karl Franz. The best statesman in the old world, the guy who wields the warhammer. You know the one, the actual real-life Warhammer logo. That's his, and he's very good at using it. He's the kind of politician who could convince you into giving him everything you own and leave you thinking you got the better deal, but also the kind of person who wouldn't do that to you. He's got everyone's interest at heart, and overall, this guy's the best emperor in Warhammer.
So he's kind of like
Warhammer Fantasy,
Gilliman.
Warhammer in general. Kiss my ass, corpse worshippers. This one can walk, talk, and beat you to death in the name of the Empire. If you like relatable folk with a touch of the fantastic, Sigmar and his people have your back. But I did say most tribes are united by Sigmar. Unfortunately, a couple weren't able to be integrated for one reason or another. Let's talk about the one that I like first.
Ooh.
Kislev is all of Eastern Europe thrown into a pot and mixed to boiling
I can
until
get
it
behind bear
coagulated into
riding.
one Slavic specialty stew. They live in a frozen hellhole, which is also their country's greatest defense. They wear thick fur pelts. They have winged hussars. They also squat in the middle of a battlefield, because such is the natural state of the Kislevite. And vodka. Even the dwarfs and their genetically ingrained alcoholism respect the drinking skills of a Kislevite. Kislev's job in the setting is to face tank chaos invasions before they get to the Empire of Man, which they do pretty well. Half their cities are torn down in the process, but they're a hardy bunch. They walk into the winter snow,
they're
and
like
when
Kaida,
everyone
like
occupying their land freezes to death, come back in and rebuild.
The first
their religion
defense
is different from the Empires, and they view them as weak Southerners, but the two nations are still staunch allies. Mostly because when the forces of actual hell are your neighbors, anyone else is going to be a good friend. They're led by the Tsar or Tsarina of Kislev, because GW was worried you wouldn't understand which region this place is based off of. Many times, and indeed the last one before the world blew up, this was an ice witch. A handy person to have one in your country
subtle
when a raging blizzard is considered a mild day. You still can't play as Kislev in the old world, thank you GW for that extreme blue balling, but they had some pretty heavy redesigns, and a lot of the marketing for the old world did at one point feature Kislev. Here's hoping GW realizes that winged hussars riding bears is something people are interested in. Shame that sentence needs to be said.
They do the same with guardsmen. They tease us with all these cool settings, but they never make a model range for them.
When Sigmar was uniting everyone, they refused to join him, because obviously they were too good to join him. Did they have some super special magical secret, or a technology that could let them surpass the fledgling empire, or some other race in the hole? No, but they copied the elves' homework and our French, so they decided they were too good to shack up with a future god and went it alone. Bretonnia looked at all the cool advancements the empire was making, how it was a dynamic nation in a genre that usually gets to the medieval era and then freezes like it's going into cryo-sleep, and said no, we will not be doing that. We will be staying as medieval land. It is mandated by the government that technology will not advance, that society will never have any major upheavals, and that everything is just perfect the way it is. It's like that old decree the Pope made that declared crossbows were a blasphemous weapon, taken to be an entire society's philosophy. Bretonnia is all about knights. Baby knights proving themselves,
they still
knights
look
defending
cool.
the realm and saving damsels, knights leading the country to further the goals and interests of the rest of the knights. Imagine King Arthur. That's it. Just imagine King Arthur stretched out to be a whole faction. The in-universe justification is that they saw high elf cavalry and just ran with the concept. Out of universe, it's just King Arthur and every medieval stereotype thrown together. You could, admittedly, say the same thing about the Empire and the Holy Roman Empire, or Kislev in Eastern Europe, but those are eras and places fantasy writers don't usually copy wholesale, so they get a pass from me. Bretonnia is the land of almost every fantasy setting ever conceived since Lord of the Rings, and it shows. Unfortunately, they can afford to do all of this fantasy stasis, because an elf goddess is playing them like a fiddle. Their precious Lady of the Lake, also known as the elf goddess of magic, chooses some super special knights to become Grail Knights. They sip from her chalice of bathwater, and when the now Grail Knight emerges, they're like supercharged D&D paladins. Bullets are an inconvenience, their armor is magically toughened, and their mounts never tire, so until the Empire invents the Gatling gun, they're able to keep being aggressive backwater dickweeds. In older lore they were tolerable, but in modern lore someone must have felt they weren't angsty enough and made them nice and extra oppressive. The peasants are honored if the noble allows them to have 3 pennies a week week instead of 2, ladies who aren't magical are property because medieval times, and social mobility
So
is a
basically
punchline.
Dark
I hope you
Ages.
like medieval medicine. The Empire's medicine already isn't that great. Bretonnian medicine is the kind of thing that has a 300% fatality rate. And horses. Everyone has a horse. Even the lowliest peasants have a horse that more often than not eats and lives better than they do. I like horses, but I don't like them that much. If you've ever been to medieval times and made that your entire personality, Bretonnia is a good faction for you. Because God is real and hates me, they're also one of the starter factions of the old world.
Oh,
so
no.
getting into Warhammer Fantasy nowadays is pound for pound fairly easily done with Bretonnia. In all honesty, pick them if you like them. It is on some level cool because for as much shit as I was giving them for being generic and bland knights, knights are cool. There's a reason every 5-year-old wants
really
to be
cool.
a knight and not a Landsknecht. I mean, for God's sakes, just trying to say that word is difficult.
Ooh,
The other
cafe.
army GW has refused to put onto the tabletop despite already having a direct hand in reworking them for Total War. Did you know there's a
They look
fully fleshed out Cathayan army book for
Warhammer
GW
version of
developed?
China.
You can't have it because funds not allowed. This is a shame because Cathay is awesome. Dragons are also awesome. Cathay agrees because they're ruled by immortal dragons who the Cathayans follow at every whim. Fantasy China is a magical place and one of the few places in the entire planet that might not be a terrible one to live in. Every now and again it does what actual China used to do and implodes, and sure, those ruling dragons get along like all siblings do, i.e. barely at all, but in day-to-day life, not a bad place. And it always comes back together after imploding, usually after mommy and daddy
I don't think I've ever heard of this
heads
faction.
in until they start behaving again. It is, like I said, just fantasy medieval China. But that is a compliment. You know those terracotta soldiers? What if they
That
were
is a
animated by
really
magic
big
and also
terracotta
100 feet
soldier.
tall? Are you a 40k fan? Imagine if the Primarchs weren't utter morons and failures almost to a man. Because that's Cathay. Again, for reasons I will never understand, we don't have them yet in tabletop. But Total War does, and by God is it fun to play as Cathay.
Maybe
the Silk Road was prosperous
we'll get them in the
real
old
life, and it's
world.
prosperous in Warhammer. So if/when they finally come out, prepare to show the world why China was for a good 1,000 years the most prosperous country on the planet. It's
It'd be
even better
an
here
interesting
because this
marketing
great wall
ploy
has
if you want to
magical
get the
dragon
Chinese
lands guarding
market.
it. Oh, Cathay is also near the countries of Nippon, Ind, and Koresh. Nippon is Japan, Ind is India, and Koresh is Southeast Asia. I'm not giving them their own spots because no one cares about them, and I can't bring myself to either. That's it for the non-chaotic living humans, but that doesn't mean we're done talking about humans. The next few ones just don't have a heartbeat. Or skin. These are the bad guys when chaos has taken a break. Imagine Dracula.
Vampires
if you
are
will.
really
now
cool.
Imagine Dracula if he had a 100,000 strong army of zombies, skeletons, lesser vampires, and pretty much anything else that you could find at a Spirit Halloween. The total history of the vampires stretches back thousands of years, but for the purposes of this video, we're only going to go back a few hundred. We go to a fella named Vlad von Karstein, because if you haven't caught on yet, this setting is allergic to subtlety. He showed up to the very on-the-nose Empire province of Sylvania, which was a horrible place to live.
That's
It was
not
covered in
particularly
swamps,
subtle
the
either.
people were dumb and afraid of scary monsters, and because this setting is what it is, they weren't even wrong to be so. When a peasant in real life says the witch made their family ill with the plague, it's baseless superstition. When a peasant in Warhammer says that, there's a good chance they're right. When a Sylvanian peasant says that, they are right. Vlad shows up to this province, marries the daughter of the ruling noble to become its next ruler, and despite being a blood-sucking vampire, this place sucked so hard it was a marked improvement. Even better, him and his wife Isabella actually loved each other. They had vampire kids like Conrad von Karstein, who is insane and liked to twist the heads off of peasants, and Manfred von Karstein, who is the worst. Of course, this wouldn't be Warhammer if everyone was just nice and peaceful, so one day Vlad had a brilliant idea.
I do like the cool armor.
What if he was the emperor? He could live forever and usher in an eternal age of prosperity, mostly for vampires, but for some of the people too. So he tried to become the emperor. At gunpoint. Zombie point more like, but 100,000 zombies is a lot more effective than most Renaissance age guns were. He failed, but the damage was done. Him, his wife, and their children spread vampirism across the empire. Now Sylvania is barely even considered a part of it, and everyone does their best to ignore it. This is probably a bad move, because every few decades some vampire likes to try their hand at raising a massive undead army
just
to
still
take over
around.
the empire with. They all fail, but they're very murderous. Them failing means the empire's population only drops by 20% instead of 100%. Just watch the first episode of Castlevania if you somehow haven't, for what it's like when the midnight aristocracy goes to war. There's a lot of vampires to choose from though to get your specific undead needs satisfied. The von Karsteins are the classic vampires who want to suck your blood and rule over the night.
They got a cool
Lamians are a
Nosferatu
vampire
version.
KGB with spy networks in pretty much every place on the planet. Except Lustria, probably. The lizards don't take kindly to that sort of thing. The Strigoi are what happens if your average Florida resident became a vampire, the Necrox are evil wizards, and the Blood Dragons are a heavy metal album cover. If you thought it was kick-ass when Dracula sent the forces of hell to wreak
really
havoc
cool
on the
when you
living,
get like
you'll love the
little
vampire
sub-factions.
but I did mention that some of the undead don't have skin,
Just
and
adds more
vampires
flavor.
usually have that at least. For those fellas, we need to go further south. Ancient Egypt. Ancient Egypt. Ancient Egypt. You now understand the basics of the Tomb Kings. Once upon a time, thousands of years in the past, the lands of Nehekhara were prosperous. They had regular contact with their gods, magical constructs to defend themselves with, and when they had a good king like Setra, they would sometimes go on to conquer half the world. Then a fella named Nagash was born.
Analogs to
He's
real
awful.
life
This man was
in
a
these
monster
factions.
through
They
and
make it
through.
very easy
He's
to
really
figure out what they're all
smart,
about.
though. Smart enough to capture dark elves and force them to teach him dark magic, which usually humans can't do. Smart enough to invent necromancy with what he learned. Smart enough to overthrow his brother, the king, and take over most of the land with his undead forces. And he's also quite powerful with his magic. He was eventually overthrown and cast into the desert where he died, but he invented necromancy. Death is a suggestion
Is
for
that what
him,
he looks like
such
now?
is his power. When he inevitably came back, he discovered someone had stolen his research notes and used them to make vampires. He made those vampires his generals, and no, they didn't have a choice in the matter, and then decided ruling just Nehekhara with undead wasn't enough. So he formed a plan to kill everyone in the region at once, resurrect every corpse on the planet, and take over the world with his World War Z undead army. Part 1 of the plan went off without a hitch. It was only through the intervention of the Skaven, who I promise you will love, and the
That is
last
some
living dude in
badass
the
armor.
region, which kept most of Part 2 from happening. Then everyone in Nehekhara promptly stood back up, realized their hearts were no longer beating but they were still standing, and things got messy. Imagine Game of Thrones before it became horrible, with all the political fighting over who gets to be king. Now imagine Game of Thrones if every single person who was ever the rightful king was now alive at the same time
they
fighting
all
over
came
what
back.
was their
They all
throne.
wanted to
Not
rule.
they believed it to be their throne, or they wanted it to be their throne. It was
Oh,
the
yeah, that
throne
would
they
be
sat
messy.
on once upon a time. And also they can respawn. And also, most common people were mindless undead skeletons who had the flesh flayed from their bones with the desert winds and could only follow basic orders, like kill that guy who thinks he's the real king. This does not a stable nation make. Luckily, the priest
No.
woke up that Setra guy, who cock-slapped everyone until they started behaving again. Now the Tomb Kings no longer have skin, have no clear path to achieve immortal bodies to feel with again that they so crave, and no longer have the backing of their very gods. Fortunately for them, death is more of a suggestion. They can still use magic, even if not quite as good as it was when the
They
gods
do
were
look
helping,
super
and
cool,
they now have
though.
eternity to do
Egypt's
whatever
one of
they
those,
want, as long as it doesn't
civilizations
involve
that has
some
a
sort
really
of
cool
physical
aesthetic.
sensation. Sometimes they still fight amongst each other, sometimes they spend their newfound immortality pursuing whatever hobbies they want, and sometimes they sail all the way from Egypt to Sweden and burn half of it to the ground because someone stole their hat. And on the rarest of occasions, a tomb queen will tell a strapping young lad that if they still had functional genitals, she'd fuck him so hard the experience would kill him. They're very fun. They're true neutral to the
Nice.
core. Some of them want conquest, some of them just want to find new hobbies, some hate the living out of jealousy, some don't
Oh,
care either
that's
way
cool.
as
They,
long
like,
as they
they
serve,
make, like,
and some go out of their way to
automatons.
find human members to recruit for their court because it reminds them of what they've lost. If you can think of a motivation, there's a Tomb King that has it. It's a very simple thing to know if the Tomb Kings are for you or not. Do you like The Mummy? Do you like Ancient
Yes.
Egypt? Have you ever wondered
Yes.
what it'd be like if the Sphinx came to life and started crushing people like
Yes.
Godzilla? Tomb Kings are perfect for you then. And hey, look at that. They're the other starter faction for the old world. Now you can get into
I would,
fantasy proper
definitely
without
be
people like me
picking the Tomb
dismissively
Kings.
calling you a horse molester. So now we can leave this region of the world and indeed humanity, and I have forgotten 4 human nations that deserve at least a little bit of credit.
Okay, since this original video is an hour long, I think we'll cut it into 2 pieces, just so it's not crazy long. But yeah, thanks for enjoying the video. If you got this far, don't forget to like and subscribe, and also comment what your favorite faction is for Warhammer Fantasy or 4K. It doesn't really matter. Yeah, thanks for watching. I hope you subscribe. Oh, and join our Discord. That's always a good thing because we always have a good chat and a laugh there. And I'll see you in the next one for part 2.